The Israelites believe in and worship only one God, and Yahweh is his name. A solitary temple, first constructed by Solomon, is his sole place of worship. All other temples and altars in the Promised Land were destroyed, torn down by the invaders, led by Yahweh's chosen champion, Joshua. One such temple, devoted to a blasphemous pagan deity known as Dagon, once stood in the city of Ashdod. Worship and sacrifice had gone on uninterrupted for over 1,000 years when an army besieged the city. During the fighting, the temple fell. It matches up nicely with what we read in Scripture, except for one small detail. The destruction of Dagon's temple in Ashdod didn't occur in the 12th or 13th century BCE, when Joshua ostensibly roamed the land at the head of Yahweh's great army. It was destroyed halfway through the 2nd century BCE by Jonathan Apphus. Worship of this deity, depicted in Assyrian art as being half man and half fish, like some sort of colossal merman, dates back at least 4,500 years, and worship of Dagon went uninterrupted at least until the 2nd century BCE in Israel and Judah, with temples and altars devoted to the fish god operating openly the entire time. Though he wasn't alone. El's wife Asherah was likewise worshipped publicly until around this same time. Until at least 147 BCE, polytheism was alive and well and even flourishing in the land of the Israelites. Its rapid decline in the late 2nd century saw the gods falling one by one until only Yahweh remained. But those other gods worshipped all along the Mediterranean did not vanish entirely. Many of them are still alive in literature today. They're disguised as mortal men and women. They wear names like Mordecai and Esther, and one of them is named Joshua. I'm your host Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Before we dive into the story of Joshua, I want to state clearly that the information you hear on this podcast does not come from me. I'm not a biblical scholar, historian, or archaeologist. I'm merely a collator of information. The source material comes from books such as Did Moses Exist by D.L. Murdoch, Moses the Egyptian by John Osman, Hebrew Myths by Robert Graves, and Holy Fables by Dr. Robert M. Price, among many, many others. In short, you're getting information from leading scholars that I'm packaging into bite-sized bits for your consumption. That said, I'm going to engage in a bit of speculation later in this episode concerning the origins of the Joshua character. But don't worry, I'll issue a disclaimer beforehand. So let's get started. In the previous episode, we left off in chapter 21 of the book of Joshua, when Yahweh declared that the entirety of the Promised Land had been given over to the Israelites who took possession of it and enjoyed peace and prosperity. Not one of their many enemies had withstood them. The genocidal war for the land was over, and the promises of Yahweh were fulfilled. With the fighting over, it was time to release the Reubenites, Gadites, and Manassites. These were 3 tribes whose land was positioned on the other side of the Jordan. They had crossed over with Joshua to help fight against the Nephilim that inhabited the land of Canaan but never once materialized in the entirety of the war. Now that the fighting was over, it was time for them to cross the Jordan again and re-enter their homeland, which they do at the beginning of chapter 22 with Joshua's blessing. He reminds them to keep Yahweh's commands and sends them off. Their first act upon reaching home is to build an altar to Yahweh, as they were instructed to do in Exodus 20, verse 22 to 24. However, this is against the new rule which allows for only one altar to Yahweh to exist. You see, the consolidation of power under the ruling class of priests would be threatened if periphery altars were allowed to stand. Hearing this, the Israelites grew outraged and fearful that Yahweh would exert his wrath on the entire nation. So they sent Phinehas, son of the high priest Eleazar, to investigate. Upon meeting with the elders there, Phinehas is told that they weren't actually going to use the altar, but built it only as a symbolic connection to Yahweh because they felt distant, for having an entire river separating them from the real temple, which hadn't even been constructed yet and wouldn't be for several more books. The priests and elders decide that this isn't such a bad idea after all and allow the altar to stand, so they send their armies home and abandon the idea of wiping out 3 of the 12 tribes of Israel. So what are we to make of this? First, it should be pointed out that at no point does it state that they were erecting an altar to worship other deities. The Israelites never even suspected that. In fact, it clearly states that they knew the altar was for the worship of Yahweh. The concern here is that offerings could be made without the Levite priests taking their cut. This tells us the story was written at a point in history when the temple worship was centralized. If it was any earlier, the concern wouldn't exist, because it would just be one more hilltop altar, of which there were hundreds, if not thousands. Levites are now in control of the temple and wish for all of the offerings to pass through their hands. However, certain concessions have to be made, as fully 1/4 of their people live beyond the river. And since Yahweh isn't going to part the waters every time someone needs to make an offering, a second altar must be allowed to stand. This story is a way for the author to explain away the existence of a second altar that everyone knows is just across the river. The story claims the altar isn't actually used for offerings, yet we know this isn't the case, as its presence wouldn't solve any problem of distance unless it were actually used. Another bit of evidence that puts the lie to this story is the argument used to justify its standing. It said that the Reubenites, Gadites, and Manassites would have to hear the children of other tribes ask, "What do you have to do with Yahweh?" Sure, they might seem to be disconnected from the Lord by a great river, but if they're crossing that river once a week to bring offerings to the temple alongside everyone else, then the claim makes no sense whatsoever. The only reason the children wouldn't see them connected with Yahweh is if they were keeping their offerings on their side of the Jordan, which they must be doing as they have their own sacrificial altar. Joshua then summons the elders to remind them of Yahweh's promises and instructions. They are still forbidden from mingling with strangers who follow strange gods, and he reminds them to not follow these gods, who belong to these other people who might still live among them. He reminds them how Yahweh drove out all who opposed them, and not one man was able to stand against them. Now, there are a couple of problems here. Like, all of it. Entire cities have stood against Yahweh and are still filled with Canaanites, including Jerusalem. The plains are teeming with Canaanites who ride around in iron chariots that Yahweh himself cannot defeat. And the idea they should not follow the strange gods of those people who still live among them doesn't make sense if all those strange people have already been vanquished. How do they live among the Israelites if not one of them was able to withstand Yahweh? And the strange gods part ignores that most of the stories of Yahweh are borrowed from those strange gods, like El Elyon and Baal Hadad. But it doesn't exactly ignore that. In a way, this is an acknowledgement of that fact. The author is writing at a time in which the people are turning away from their ancestral gods and converting to Yahwism. But as this new version of Yahwism exists as a monotheistic counter-religion, they must not only sever their connections with those ancestral gods, but deny their existence altogether. So they pretend that their pagan ancestors are a separate breed of people, and that the tribe of Israel isn't a group of Canaanites, but a distinct race arrived recently from some foreign land. The reason for inventing this division in not only their history, but in their theology, has little to do with Yahweh. Yahweh had been worshipped in the region for nearly 1,000 years alongside other deities, and while he grew in popularity while the other gods fell out of favor, temples to the old gods still stood and operated openly. This new intolerance and denial of the very existence of every deity save for Yahweh has an external source, and it's tied in with the centralization of power in the temple. This source, which also brought with it such ideas as evil inhabiting the underworld, the entire concept of the devil, a messianic teacher who fasted in the desert and was then tempted by the devil, the idea that sorcerers and magicians were evil and should be killed, punishment of the wicked in the afterlife, the idea of clean and unclean animals, the idea that God was all-seeing, the concept of archangels, the demotion of old gods to the status of demons, devotion to God being expressed not through sacrifice and covenant, but through loving your neighbor, the eternal struggle between the forces of light and darkness and mankind's role in that struggle, Satan having rule over the earth, and even the concept of the Trinity was the single most influential force in Jewish theology. And yes, it's that same subject I keep teasing, and I promise that particular bonus episode is coming. Anyway, back to Joshua. He warns that following these other gods will ultimately lead to Israel suffering defeats by invading armies, resulting in them being driven from their lands. This passage is used to explain past defeats at the hands of Assyria and Babylon, both of which resulted in mass displacement of Israelites. This theology was a way for them to accept defeat while still following Yahweh. Often in ancient times, when one city or nation defeated another, the loser would abandon their god and follow the patron deity of the victor, believing that the other god must have been more powerful than their own. And we know this happened in Israel as well, as some of them went over to worship Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. Though most of them stuck with their own gods, and when they were making the switch to monotheism, they needed a way of explaining their losses. If Yahweh was the only God, and all-powerful, how could they lose? If their ancestors had turned away from Yahweh, they could have incurred his wrath. This served a double purpose. It drove home the urgency of abandoning their ancestral gods and following only Yahweh, and it got Yahweh off the hook for dropping the ball on virtually every war that his favorite people ever fought. This was the beginning of the idea of thanking God for every good thing and blaming oneself for every negative occurrence. Got a promotion? Thank God. Tornado destroyed the neighborhood? Must have been punishment for sinning, but he's still looking out for us. It's a clumsy answer for the theological problem of explaining evil within the bounds of monotheism. And though this answer is clumsy, they'll only have it for a short time before adopting a much better explanation, which of course also comes from that same external source I keep mentioning. Like the earlier chapters in which the author recounts the division of land amongst the tribes, chapter 24 gives a brief retelling of the history of Israel, or rather it reiterates the fictive history the Deuteronomist is presenting to the nation. Though repetitive, there are a few items of note in chapter 24. The first comes in verse 2, when Joshua claims that Yahweh was the God of Abraham and of Israel. But we know that that is not the case. El Elyon was the God of Abraham, and his name is even found within the name of Israel. He was the patron deity of that confederation of tribes, not Yahweh. This is another attempt in a long line to conflate the Canaanite patronly god El with the Edomite war god Yahweh. Next item of interest comes in verses 6 and 7 when it states that the people present to hear this address by Joshua are those same Israelites who crossed the Sea of Reeds back in Exodus. The 40-year wandering in the desert and the death of all those who angered Yahweh at the border of the Promised Land back in the book of Numbers are details unknown to this author. This is not a new generation of Israelites, but the same people who escaped from Egypt. Right after this, we reach the point where he recounts the story of Balaam. If you recall, he's the guy who had a conversation with his ass. In the story, Balaam was summoned to curse the Israelites, but he consulted with Yahweh beforehand and received instructions to present himself to the kings and do only as Yahweh commanded. But on the road, Yahweh changed his mind and sent a Satan to kill him. His donkey saw the invisible angel and refused to approach, causing an argument between the two in which the donkey actually spoke. The angel then approached, informed Balaam that the donkey had just saved his life, and then gives him permission to pass. The entire scene makes absolutely no sense. Balaam then presents himself to the king and goes about constructing altars upon which to make sacrifice and thus invoke curses against Israel. But since he's in cahoots with Yahweh, he instead blesses the invaders on 3 separate occasions. When the Israelites attack, they're victorious, thanks in no small part to Balaam's blessings. But they execute Balaam for no apparent reason. He's a Yahwist and repeatedly blessed them. But that part of the text says that he stood against Israel. Here in chapter 24, it says much the same thing. It states that Balaam was cursing Israel, not blessing them, a clear contradiction to the longer version of the story that we saw earlier. Obviously, there were at least 2 versions of that particular story floating around. One was preserved in the second half of Numbers, but a second version is referenced here in the second half of Joshua. But it's clear by the punishment mentioned in Numbers that the compiler of that book was aware of the second version of the story. After this, we see another curious passage in verses 14 to 15 when it states, "Put away the gods that your forefathers served." But according to other passages, it's the Canaanites who still live among them who serve the strange gods. We even have other verses that say, "strange gods that your forefathers never knew." So which is it? Were they always monotheist, or were they once pagans? It's obvious that there are 2 different views being represented. One wishes to portray the people as having always been monotheistic, drawing a sharp line between the Israelites and the Canaanites. The other recognizes that they grew from polytheistic roots, but have now cast aside those gods, which they no longer need. In verses 19 to 20, it states that Yahweh does not forgive sins, which matches up quite well with the theology presented here, but completely contradicts the later teachings of Christianity in the New Testament. Then in verse 23, Joshua tells the Israelites to put away their alien gods and serve only Yahweh. But, as I stated, according to the story, Israel has not yet turned to these foreign gods. That will not happen until after the temple is established, at least according to this version of history. This is a new command clumsily pretending to be ancient. This would also cause complications, as it's stated that the entire reason Yahweh is killing off the Canaanites is because they worship other gods. So they're being punished for doing the exact same thing he acknowledges the Israelites of doing. Joshua then makes a new covenant with Yahweh, becoming the 5th such person to do so, and records a new set of teachings to help the Israelites establish a civilization. And then he died at the age of 110, becoming only the 3rd major character since the time of Noah to actually obey that rule that no one should live beyond 120 years. Joseph and Moses being the other 2, living 110 and 120 years respectively. All 3 patriarchs and every ancestor linking Abraham to Noah far exceeded this limit on lifespan. We're then told in verse 32 that Jacob's bones, which were brought up from Egypt, were buried in the Promised Land as mentioned at the end of Genesis, capping the story and bringing the entire exile and return full circle. And thus ends the story of Joshua. But who was Joshua? Where did this fascinating character come from? There's no reason to believe he's based on any historical figure, as his life and deeds are completely unconnected from history. And in fact, the events of his story are all part of a fictive history presented by reformers to justify changes in theology. But why Joshua? Why this type of character? The answer to that lies in his name, Joshua, son of Nun. The man is a folk hero who predates this book and the story of Moses. But he wasn't always a man. In Hebrew mythology, we have countless examples of deities being demoted. As these ancient people made the long and gradual journey toward monotheism, their polytheistic mythology had to adapt. Legends of their deities were transformed, along with the deities themselves, becoming stories of men and women. A perfect example would be the story of a sun god whose 7 golden locks of hair represented the yellow rays of the sun. He ruled over the desert with harsh brutality, able to dispatch entire armies of men and ferocious beasts single-handedly. But he falls to the moon goddess, who shears off those rays of light and blinds him, casting him into darkness. But as the moon reigns, the sun gathers strength, and in the darkness, his golden locks regrow. In his triumphant return, he banishes the night and the moon with it. I'm of course talking about Samson, though he's not our only god who is demoted to the status of mortal. Joshua is another. Or rather, Joshua is a composite of 2 deities of vast importance to the people of ancient Palestine. Joshua, meaning Yahweh is salvation, and son of Nun, or son of the fish, denoting his connection to Dagon. From a modern monotheistic viewpoint, this makes no sense. But from ancient people growing out of polytheism, it's perfectly natural. Dagon, like his parallels across the Mediterranean, came up from the waters to bring civilization, agriculture, and wisdom to the people. Literacy, law, and bountiful harvests are his gifts to mankind. And we see Joshua bringing all 3 to the Israelites in this one book, though in a more warlike fashion than is customary for Dagon. A new covenant is established, despite the Levites toting around the old one, and this message must be read by all generations to come. The manna has stopped falling from heaven just as Joshua takes over the fields from the Canaanites, giving us our first example in 6 entire books of a positive view of agriculture. In all previous instances, the shepherds clashed with the farmers, beginning with Cain and Abel and concluding with the Israelites and the Canaanites. Joshua commands the waters of the Jordan to stop flowing, and 2 million people are able to walk through on dry land. He also commands a change in the weather, clearing the skies and forcing the sun to stand still, bathing the land in harsh sunlight during a battle. The old Canaanite god Dagon had been transformed into a folk hero. This folk hero's name is now forgotten, lost to pre-literate history, but his connection to the mighty fish god was preserved. The stories of this folk hero were then merged with stories from another, a mighty warrior who led armies to victory and destroyed entire cities with the power of his voice. As the primary god of Israel grew in size, becoming more distant yet more omnipresent, his older stories of a time when he was seen as little more than a Palestinian Superman were converted. Remember how, in Genesis, when Yahweh would visit the Garden of Eden, he would only do so in the cooler times of day, when he would stroll around through the shade and avoid the harsh sunlight. Or when he arrived on the field just before the Battle of Jericho to remind the army they were standing on holy ground. These were older versions of the deity when he was seen more like the gods of Olympus, a mighty warrior with a spear and a war horn and a bow, who attacked at night and his name was carried on the wind. I've long suspected that Yahweh was not only the name of a deity, but also the battle cry of the gruesomely violent Shasu tribe who first worshipped him. And after rereading the scene in Joshua 6, when the Israelites collectively invoke the power of Yahweh and give a mighty shout to bring down the city's walls, my belief is strengthened. As time went on, the legends of this Superman named Yahweh, who hunted down his rivals and impaled them on spears in the desert and laid waste to entire cities, were relegated to those of a man, as Yahweh had eventually become not only the slayer of dragons, as we'll see in Job, capable of self-resurrection, as we'll see in Psalms, but ultimately the creator of the entire universe. Fighting against a single army or a city would be beneath him. These two deities, now living on in stories as folk heroes, were eventually merged into one man, whose name literally means the salvation of Yahweh and the descendant of Dagon. This composite character then became intertwined with the history and origin of an entire ethnic group. But is this story even more complex than that? So at some time in the ancient past, probably prior to 500 to 600 BCE, the aforementioned occurred. The stories of a folk hero once known as Dagon, helping to found ancient civilization and establish law, literacy, and agriculture, were merged with the stories of a second folk hero who is based on the now popular deity Yahweh. These stories involved conquest, destruction, and slaughter of not only people, but of other gods as well, mirroring the opinions of the northern kingdom at the time, as they were casting off their old gods in favor of Yahweh. That is when this hero took form. Now here's where I engage in my own speculation, so please take the following with a grain of salt. Around the 5th century BCE, or possibly earlier, Jews living in Egypt, especially those in the fortress of Elephantine, whose job it was to keep an eye on the Egyptians for their Persian masters, merged this folk hero with Egyptian heroes, changing his name to associate him with an Egyptian deity. Perhaps Nemu, who controlled the Nile and is depicted with a ram's head, becoming a hero named Nemusis. Or perhaps it was the god Thoth to become Tutmos, or the god Ra to become Ramses. Though for this particular example I'll stick with Nemu, as it fits nicely with the horned visage of Moses that we see in Exodus 34. This Nemusis grew in popularity with the Jews living in Egypt and eventually made his way back to Israel at some undetermined point in time. His name, however, was problematic, as it invoked an Egyptian god, which was wholly unwelcome. So the first half of his name, the part of his name that invokes the name of a deity, was dropped, leaving behind only the triple consonants MSS, creating the incomplete name of Moses. These two literary clones evolved independently, one in Egypt and the other back home in Palestine. It was an evolution that changed them enough so that they were not recognized as duplicates. Then they met up once again and became major characters in the Deuteronomic history that rewrote the entire origin of the nation. That's my hypothesis, that Moses is an Egyptianized version of the same mythic hero upon which Joshua is based. Now, why would I say that? Why would I suggest that these two pivotal figures share a common literary ancestor, especially when the topic is virtually unknown in scholarly articles? I've only found a handful of articles that make vague connections between Moses and Joshua, but nothing to suggest that they were once the same character, and only 3 to 5 parallels are listed to link the two, which is hardly enough to suggest any sort of strong connection. My reasoning is simple. There are not 3 to 5 direct parallels linking Moses to Joshua. How this has been overlooked, I honestly have no idea. But searching for books and scholarly articles concerning this connection has been utterly fruitless. There are, at my current count, and I have discovered 9 more just today, 33 direct parallels between Moses and Joshua. So if you have a minute, I'll list them all for you right here. Both were called by Yahweh to lead Israel. Both were called Yahweh's servants. Both sent spies to scout the promised land. Both have 2 spies return to them with favorable news. Both parted a major body of water. Both led people across on dry land. Moses was given manna but promised fruit, while Joshua no longer received manna and was given fruit. Both witnessed Yahweh appear to them in person. Both are said to have enjoyed the presence of Yahweh. Both interpreted the will of Yahweh. Both founded a teaching. Both were said to be made great in the eyes of Israel by Yahweh. Both faced people with hardened hearts. Both gave a final speech to Israel immediately prior to their deaths. Both made treaties with their enemies whom they were instructed to kill. Both led Israel in a vast military campaign. Both celebrate Passover immediately prior to leading an army. Both were uncircumcised when their journey began. Both were told to remove their sandals prior to receiving instructions from Yahweh. Both were reminded they were standing on holy ground. Both used the power of Yahweh to defeat an enemy. Both exercise power over the sun. Both extend magic weapons to defeat an army. Moses extends a staff to defeat the Amalekites. Joshua extends a sword to defeat the city of Ai. Both intercede with Yahweh after Israel fails to obey a ban. Both have their God-given missions interrupted by circumcision. Both were born in Egypt. Both were accompanied by a plague that killed their enemies. Both led an army of men and women. Both carved teachings on a stone upon a mountain. Both remind the people to keep ancient festivals. Both remind the people to keep practicing ancient sacrifices. Both remind the people to keep a new covenant. And both are referred to as Savior. Again, the idea that Joshua and Moses are 2 versions of the same folk hero will not be found in any scholarly works, at least none that I've been able to track down. It's just my own humble supposition. There could be many explanations for these parallels, and since I am not a biblical scholar, this idea should be treated as nothing more than the supposition of a podcaster. That concludes the story of Joshua, though he will pop up again when we talk about a proto-Christian cult referred to in the book of Zechariah. But before you run off, I have a couple of questions from a listener. Minor, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, has 2 questions. First, will you be going into the New Testament in future episodes? Absolutely. I'm eager to start on the New Testament, and so eager, in fact, that I'm seriously considering the idea of skipping much of the Old Testament. Now, as a warning to you all, after the episodes on Judges and Zoroastrianism and a couple episodes on the monarchy, the Old Testament might fall by the wayside. Now, this doesn't mean that I won't be coming back to some of the cool stories in the first half of the Bible, like Jonah and the whale or the book of Job, and I'm not even fully committed to this decision yet, but I might be skipping ahead to the New Testament in the near future. Next question. I've been having fun bringing up the idea of the horned Moses to my more religious friends, and one informed me that the translation was off, claiming that St. Jerome was responsible for the error, where it should have read shining light instead of horns. I don't believe that St. Jerome would have made such an error, or there would be horns on many others, possibly. I was wondering if you had any insights on his response in relation to St. Jerome making translation errors. That is a very important question. When Jerome was working on his translation and encountered the troublesome word in question, he had a judgment call to make. The Hebrew word could indeed mean that Moses had horns, or that he was glowing. Working directly from a copy of the Hebrew Bible that was written in Hebrew, Jerome chose to depict Moses with horns. Now, this decision has been openly criticized by scholars pretty much as soon as he made his translation. Most translations, including every mass market copy of the Bible, depicts Moses as glowing, similar to depictions of Jesus with a halo. And I can fully understand and appreciate the arguments for both of these decisions. However, I do not use the Latin Vulgate, which is Jerome's translation. When I'm examining these passages, and that passage in particular, I choose to ignore every single translation ever made by any Christian because of all the controversy surrounding it. Rather than view it through the lens of another religion, I choose to trust in the views held by the adherents of Judaism. In the mid-3rd century BCE, a full 6 centuries before Jerome was even born, a group of Jewish scribes set about translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek. This translation was called the Septuagint. These scribes, who understood their own religion far better than any modern Christians ever could, and with access to copies of the Hebrew text no longer available to modern scholars, and a firm grasp on the Greek language, they made the conscious decision to remove the ambiguity from that particular passage. We know that they understood the word for shining because they use a Greek word for shining in passages that depict light. And we know that they could correctly use the Greek word for horns because they employ it in passages that refer to horns. And in the passage in question, the Jewish scholars working in the 3rd century BCE who held these beliefs sacred translated that word to mean horned, not shining. I mean, I suppose it is possible that Jerome saw the word and just picked a meaning off the top of his head. But it is far more likely that he was aware of the translation made by the Jewish scribes centuries earlier because it was more common and more widely distributed than the Hebrew text that he was working from. But even if he was ignorant to the existence of the Greek translation and did indeed make a mistake, it doesn't matter because the ancient Israelites were the ones who first cleared up the matter and gave Moses his horns. And it is their work, their translations, that I work from, and not those of St. Jerome or any other Christian. So, thank you for your questions. I hope that helps you out and clears up the matter. Going forward, anyone who wants to write in doesn't have to wait around for the next AOMA episode. Just send me a message and I'll try to include your question with an answer on the next episode of the podcast. Until then, please like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis, where you can send me any questions or comments. Subscribe and give us a good review on iTunes. And as always, thank you for listening.